Alright guys, welcome back. Alright, we're on Genesis chapter 30. Alright, we're doing well. Alright, we're pushing on. Alright, we're on verse 25. So without further ado, alright, grab your Bibles and follow along. I'm on the NIV version. If you don't have a Bible, all good, I'll read out the verses anyway. Alright, let's start with a quick prayer. Father, I pray as we read your word that you sanctify us by your truth. Your word is truth. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Genesis chapter 30, verse 25. Alright. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages and I will pay them." Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages you have paid me, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." Right, so after Joseph is born, right, Jacob asks Laban to let him return home. But Laban wants him to stay because he knows God has blessed him through Jacob. Right, so Jacob proposes an unusual wage, right? He would take only the future speckled, spotted, and dark animals from Laban's flocks, right? And Laban agrees to this, right? So Joseph's birth has changed everything, right? Up to this point, Jacob has been surviving, right? Now he starts thinking about legacy, right? He wants independence, to be independent, right? But notice how Laban admits God has blessed him because of Jacob, right? So even imperfect believers, they still carry the blessing of the covenant, right? The covenant blessing. But here's a little shift, right? God will no longer allow Laban to live off Jacob's favor, right? There comes a time when God transfers blessing from the exploiter, person who's been exploiting things, to the faithful, right? Jacob's wage proposal sounds foolish, right? He removes all currently spotted animals, right? Reducing genetic odds in his favor, right? Humanly speaking, it's a losing deal, right? But Jacob isn't depending on, just odds, right? He's depending on the covenant, right? Laban thinks that he's won again. He's almost prideful with this. But we'll see that greed often blinds a person to divine timing. Verse 35. That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made them white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself, and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there, So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Right, so Laban separates the flocks by 3 days' journey to prevent mixing. Right, Jacob uses peeled branches during mating seasons. Right, the stronger animals produced spotted offspring. Right, and we see that Jacob becomes wealthy. Right, this section confuses people. Right, it even still a little bit confuses me. Like, did the stick cause the spots? Right, no. Right, in chapter 31, right, it clarifies that God did it. Right, the branches were not biology. Right, it wasn't a biological thing. They were just belief. So either one, God instructed Jacob to act symbolically, or two, Jacob acted in partial, superstition, right? And God had blessed him anyway, right? But the dream later revealed the truth that God was controlling the genetics, right? And I guess the deeper lesson here is human methods do not limit divine sovereignty, right? Even if Jacob's understanding was incomplete, right? God's control was not incomplete, right? And also the strategy that Jacob used here, right? Jacob ensures that the stronger animals became his, right? That wasn't greed, right? It was an act of wisdom after years of being exploited, right? For 14 years, Jacob was used, right? Now God's allowing him to build. So prosperity here is not selfish wealth, right? Jacob wasn't being selfish here. It's more covenant positioning, right? Jacob is being prepared to return home, right? Not as a refugee, right? Chapter 31, verse 1. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Right, so Laban's son, right, accuses Jacob of stealing their inheritance. Right, and Laban's attitude starts to shift. Right, God tells Jacob it's time to return home. Right, so jealousy always follows like the visible blessing. Right, Laban sees that it's visible that Jacob has this blessing, and jealousy always follows with that. For years they were happy while Jacob benefited them. Right, now that Jacob's benefiting himself, right, they feel this sense of resentment towards him. Right, and that reveals their true heart. Right, so we see that God's timing is very precise. Right, He doesn't tell Jacob to leave during prosperity. He tells him to leave when, hostility starts to rise or has risen. So blessing is not meant to entrap you in dangerous environments. Alright. One other thing, notice how when God says return, He adds, I will be with you. Right? So the presence of God is more important than, favorable circumstances, right? Situations that favor you. Right? God being with you is more favorable than that. Verse 4. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. Alright, so Jacob explains Laban's deception and God's protection, right? How God's protected him. Right, Jacob meets Rachel and Leah privately, right? And he explains how Laban repeatedly changed his wages, but God overruled every single scheme, right? And prospered him anyway. Right, so this is almost the 20 years of pressure, right? Summarized, right? Laban kept changing the terms repeatedly. Each time Jacob adapted. Each time God intervened. And I guess the important principle here is that God does not always prevent injustice, right? But he prevents injustice when it's defeating his purpose. So sometimes God will let injustice happen, but once it starts defeating his purpose, he will not let that injustice happen. Right? Laban manipulated wages, right? What did God do? He manipulated genetics. Right? Laban tried to reduce Jacob, but God elevated Jacob. Right? You cannot outmaneuver the providence of God. Right? That's the important message that I see here. Verse 10. In breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. Right, so Jacob shares that God showed him in a dream that it was God causing the spotted animals to be born. Right, the angel of God identifies himself as the God of Bethel, right, and commands Jacob to return home. So now we get the theological explanation, right, behind the strange breeding, right, verses. God says, I've seen all that Laban is doing to you. Right, so God saw all the deception that Laban was doing to Jacob. He saw the wage changes. He saw the injustice, right? And he acted on it. Right? God controls what humans think is random, right? Even reproduction patterns are under divine command, right? There is no such thing as luck, right? In covenant life, right? There's no such thing as luck. And notice how God identifies himself as the God of Bethel. Right, he reminds Jacob of the vow that was made 20 years earlier. Right, again, God does not forget his promises, right, especially the ones that we make. Jacob may have grown busy and forgot, but God did not forget. Right, now it's time for that vow to start maturing and mature. In verse 14. Then Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you. Alright, so Rachel and Leah, they agree to leave. Right, they acknowledge their father has treated them like property and consumed their dowry. Right, they recognize that God has justly transferred the wealth to Jacob. Right, this is shocking, right? These sisters were once rivals, but now they speak with unity, right? Sense of togetherness. And that tells us that, when we share hardship with someone, or shared hardship, right, often produces to shared clarity as well, right? You start to see through things, right? They see Laban clearly now, right? He did not value them. He simply used them, his sisters, right? Their father sold them, right? Spent their worth, protected his own wealth. And they recognize something that's spiritually important, right? God's, redistribution was justice, right? It wasn't theft, right? When exploitation is long-term, restoration looks even more dramatic, right? Because it's been going on for such a long time. But it's God correcting things, right? It's not robbery. Right. Another thing I want to point out is notice how they say whatever God has said to you, do it. Right? That is covenant alignment. Right? For the first time in the narrative, this household is spiritually unified. Right? And that unity comes right before departure, right before they leave. I'm going to wrap it up there on verse 16. All right. Thank you guys for following along. If you've watched this far, listened this far, I appreciate it a lot. Hopefully you keep following along and watch the next video. May God bless you, protect you all, keep you safe. I hope you have the good rest of your day, week, weekend, whatever it is. See you guys.